Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Let's begin. My name is Dr. Alexander Carpenter. I'm the director of the Wirth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies at the University of Alberta. It's my great pleasure to welcome you virtually to today's talk, the 2022 annual Toby and Saul Reichert Holocaust Lecture. This campus and community-wide public lecture is made possible by the support of the broader Edmonton community, as well as Mr. Saul and the late Mrs. Toby Reichert. Saul Reichert was born in Pabianice, Poland. He was 9 years old at the outbreak of World War II. Following the German occupation of their hometown, Saul's family home, business and possessions were plundered, and they were forced to resettle in the Vilna Ghetto. From there, they were eventually shipped to the notorious Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. Upon arriving here, Saul was separated from his mother and sister and never saw them again. Saul managed to survive and was liberated by US troops in May of 1945. The Reicherts regard the Wirth Institute's lecture series as a way of keeping knowledge and understanding of the Holocaust alive among future generations of students, not only serving the purpose of commemorating the tragedy, but as a cautionary epistle against such monumental injustices perpetuated on the innocent. I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Justin Cammy. We made some Herculean efforts to host him on campus this year, but scheduling conflicts were such that it was impossible, but we are very keen to have him back in person in the near future, and I know that Dr. Cammy is likewise keen, so please stay tuned for that. Justin Cammy is a literary and cultural historian with research and teaching interests in Yiddish literature, Eastern European Jewish cultural history, and contemporary Israel. He is professor of Jewish studies and of world literatures at Smith College in Massachusetts, but he is originally Canadian, born and raised in Ottawa, Ontario, and he undertook some of his post-secondary studies at McGill University before moving on to Harvard for his graduate work. He is chair of both the program in world literatures and the program in Jewish studies, director of the Translation Studies Concentration, faculty co-director of STRIDE, which is Student Research and Departments, and secretary to the faculty. He is also a longtime member and advisor in the programs in Middle Eastern Studies and Russian and East European Studies. Dr. Cammy's publications range from essays on Yiddish literary history, to scholarly translations of historical texts, to introductions to new editions of works by Yiddish writers and memoirists. He is a leading authority on the writers of the interwar literary group Young Vilna. His critical edition of Abraham Sutzkever's From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg won the 2022 Canadian Jewish Literary Award, and he was a finalist of the 2021 National Jewish Book Award. The title of Dr. Cammy's talk today is From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg, Yiddish Poetry and Witnessing. And so with that, I will turn it over to Professor Cammy. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, can you hear me, Alex? Excellent, perfect. So I'm deeply honored to deliver the annual Toby and Saul Reichert Holocaust Lecture at the University of Alberta. I want to thank Alex, Professor Carpenter, my colleagues at the Wirth Institute. I'm really delighted to be back home in Canada, even if virtually this afternoon, though I'm on my way tomorrow morning to Montreal, where I'll be speaking at McGill and the Jewish Public Library. So I'm on my way. You probably didn't realize when you invited me how au courant we really are, because anyone who's watching now, who was also watching 60 Minutes on Sunday night, probably saw an episode, a segment of 60 Minutes called The Paper Brigade, for which I served as a consultant, and in which the book that I just finished translating and editing and curating was featured at the end. So after my talk tonight, if any of you are interested in learning a bit more, you can go online, look at 60minutes.com, and you can see that short segment there as well. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about this text that I translated by quoting from the diary of this Yiddish poet by the name of Avram Sutzkever. His diary notes of when he went and testified on behalf of Soviet Jewry, really on behalf of all Jews, because he was the only witness on behalf of the Soviets who happened to be Jewish, testifying at the Nuremberg trials. And he writes the following in his diary. I haven't been this overcome by an experience for quite some time. I stood for 10 minutes in front of my apartment and couldn't even recognize it. I feel the terrible responsibility of my upcoming journey. I pray that the souls of the martyrs find expression in my words. I want to speak Yiddish, absolutely and only Yiddish. I spoke about this with Ilya Ehrenberg, with the chief counselor, Justice Smirnov, and with everyone else I came across. I want to speak the language of the people whom the accused attempted to exterminate along with their language. Let them hear our Mamaloshin. Let them hear our language, and let those on trial explode in astonishment. May my language triumph at Nuremberg as a symbol of its unshakability. Then immediately after his testimony on February 27th, 1946, Sutzkever writes the following in the same diary. I have just concluded my testimony before the Nuremberg tribunal. The words are still glowing on my lips, words that I shrieked out before the entire world and for future generations. I was shaken to my very core. It was, without a question, the most powerful experience of my 30-some years of life. It cannot be other than divine providence who put Russian in my mouth. I myself was not certain that I would manage to express my feelings and my memories in that language. And it's still difficult to take stock of my feelings. Which is stronger, my sorrow or my desire for revenge? It seems to me that greater than either is the radiant and powerful feeling that our people lives, that it has outlived its executioners, and that no dark force can annihilate it. In a Jewish twist of fate, a Yiddish poet, perhaps the only Yiddish poet still alive from the ghettos of Europe, has come to Nuremberg to cast judgment on the Nazis, and in so doing, perhaps also on the surviving remnants of fascism in other countries. And he writes in that same diary about his testimony, this final line that I want to cite. I twice rejected the marshal's invitation to sit down in the witness stand, as was customary for witnesses. I spoke standing, as if I was saying Kaddish, that is the Jewish memorial prayer for the dead. So the real question we have before us is, how did Sutzkever, a Yiddish modernist poet before the war, who had spent 2 years in the Vilna Ghetto and then half a year at a partisan camp, come to testify at Nuremberg? And how is it that we have not only his diary notes, but eventually an entire memoir of this period? Well, in the late spring and summer of 1944, Sutzkever, then 31 years old, drafted what would be his only full-length nonfiction volume, a prose account of his memories of the ghetto, which he called Von Vilna Ghetto, or Of the Vilna Ghetto. The memoir was published in 2 different editions, one by Emes, which is the Yiddish word for truth, the same as the Russian word for pravda, which was an official state organ in Moscow. And around the same time, another edition appeared under the imprint of the Association of Vilna Natives in France. And we see here the Yiddish covers of both of those editions. While he was at work on these chronicle of his time in the ghetto, his literary energies were really devoted to editing a volume of his wartime lyrics, which appeared at the same time in New York under the title of The Fortress, and the initial drafts of what would become an epic poem, Geheimstadt, about a community of Jews hiding from the Nazis in the sewers of Vilna. Sutzkever, while writing his ghetto memoir, was also shuttling back and forth between Moscow and Vilna, having finished the initial draft of the chronicle before the city's liberation in July 1944. He returned home within a week to encounter a landscape of complete devastation. His editors in Moscow then encouraged him to use his time back at home to add a section on the liberation, which he did, though again, most of his energies while there were not devoted to the memoir itself, but to assisting his colleagues in digging up the cultural treasures that they had hidden and to establish a museum, first in an apartment he shared with fellow Yiddish writer Shmerka Ketraginsky, and then on the grounds of the former ghetto itself. It wasn't until mid-September 1944 that he would return back to his wife in Moscow. So the real question we see here in a slide, the streets of the empty ghetto after it's been liquidated on the left, and Sutzkever himself standing in the ruins of what had been the Schulhof, for the Vilna synagogue courtyard, after his return to Vilna after the city's liberation in July 1944. But perhaps I'm more interested in situating this within the broader question of Jewish life before the war and its relationship to Holocaust writing, because I tell my students, I'm teaching this semester not only a course on Holocaust history at Smith College, but also a different course on Holocaust history at Amherst College, that the learning about the Holocaust makes no sense to me unless we also learn about Jewish life prior to World War II. That is, the interest in how Jews died should be carefully balanced with how Jews lived, and not only lived during the war, but lived and created their own independent culture before the war. Sutzkever had come of age as a teenager and young adult, and as a Yiddish poet in an environment in which the community's leading figures modeled respect for not only Jewish culture, but especially its languages. And although he was educated in a Polish Hebrew gymnasium and fell in love with the Polish Romantics while attending lectures at the city's Batory University, he published his first Yiddish poems in a songbook of the Yiddish scouting movement, because Jews couldn't join the Polish scouting movement because of nativism and anti-Semitism. Among the oaths he swore upon his initiation as a Yiddish scout was one to serve Yiddish culture. And he probably couldn't have predicted when he swore that oath just how much he was going to be called upon to actually serve that culture. Beginning in 1934, he grew into the leading voice of the local Yiddish literary group Young Vilna, publishing in its magazine and befriending other group members. Although he was initially denied membership in the group because his audition materials didn't meet the group's expectations that poetry serve a socio-political cause, that is, it wasn't sufficiently progressive, wasn't sufficiently leftist. His talent was undeniable, and the decision was soon overturned. During the 1930s, he eagerly recited his verse at public events while cultivating artistic fellowship with Yiddish modernist poets in New York. Before the invasion of Vilna in June 1941, Sutzkever published 2 volumes of poetry, one called Lieder, or Poems, 1937, and the other Waldiks, or Woodlore, from 1940. They solidified his reputation as one of the most independent new voices in Yiddish poetry. His lyrics fused romantic influences with modernist experimentation, and his belief in poetry as a contemporary form of spiritual expression was remarkable, given the context of their composition. And all of this was done in Vilna, a city that was multicultural and multilingual, a Polish border town city that was also claimed by the Lithuanians as their capital, Vilnius, that would be invaded and change hands multiple times during Sutzkever's time there. Despite the storm clouds hanging over Europe, Sutzkever's poetic output in the last years of the 1930s showed a deepening faith in Yiddish poetry as sacred realm. In this volume, Waldiks, that I mentioned from 1940, it appeared when much of Polish Jewry, this is remarkable, was already under Nazi occupation, right? The war had started in September 1939. Vilna, however, had passed from the Red Army occupation to Lithuanian rule, and eventually would go back to Soviet rule before it would fall to the Nazis in the summer of 1941. Given the context of its publication in 1940, its exuberance still surprises, as when he writes, "In everything I come upon, I see a splinter of infinity," or "Every moment without a hymn is a shame to me." Such lines were a statement of spiritual defiance, an affirmation of his claim over the Polish-Lithuanian landscape at a moment when Jews were regarded as alien, and an embrace of love over the paralyzing forces of fear or hatred. His belief in the mystical powers of his verse was such that if tradition had it that the universe came into being through God's word, then Jewish modernity must develop its own language through which to articulate the sacredness of existence. Indeed, in that final section of Waldiks, of that book published in 1940, that he called Ecstasies, we may find the most joyful release of poetic enthusiasm in all of pre-war Yiddish literature. He writes, "Now take up my word and my metaphor, and wherever you command, I will go." In later years, Sutzkever observed that he cherished this volume more than 24 others that he wrote over the course of his life. In it, readers would find the definitive statement of an aesthetic worldview. "I am youth. I am beginning. Tell me, Why are people putting up barriers when I give myself to joy, to driving away sadness? People believe that my bright light distorts perspective, but in the end, I am rhythm, I am soul, I am music. Even before the Nazis arrived, Stalin's commissars returned to Vilna and seized it from the Lithuanian authorities, who had seized it from the Polish authorities. They unleashed a reign of terror during which some of the leading Yiddishist intellectuals disappeared. Sutzkever feared that his pre-war affiliations and political unreliability as an aesthete might make him a target. He had written to his brother in Palestine in an attempt to get a visa, but British limitations on Jewish immigration sealed his fate. He and his wife Reichert attempted to outrun the German invasion in June 1941 by fleeing east towards the Russian interior. But when the route became precarious, they turned back. During the roundup of local Jews during the initial weeks of Nazi occupation of Vilna, Sutzkever hid beneath the roof of his mother's house, pecking a hole in the wood to allow in enough light for him to write. Even here, he resolved that no matter what, quote, my words would keep on singing. He was later hidden by a local non-Jewish woman, whom he would refer to later as my rescuer. Decades later, he would write about his return back to Vilna, where he would, thanks to her, come face to face, quote, with my own double, pledging, I will tell it all to my pencil. Those who had taken him to task for his aesthetic aloofness before the war soon realized that his belief in poetry as a transcendent domain only deepened the authority of his voice in extremis. Sutzkever's 2 years in the Vilna Ghetto would be among his most productive of a very young career, revealing the full scope of his responsibility as a writer and as a witness to the destruction of his community. During that period, his artistic discipline and endurance were tested in unprecedented ways. Within half a year of the German arrival, more than 3/4 of the city's Jews were already dead. Most had been shot in huge pits in the Panari forest, a few kilometers from the city center. Sutzkever's own mother was betrayed by an agent and dragged from their apartment, never to be seen again. His guilt over his inability to protect her might have consumed him had he not worked through his own mourning poetically, to hear her voice in his mind revive him. If you are still here, he hears her in his mind, then I exist too. After this period of mass slaughter, Sutzkever and his wife found themselves confined to the ghetto. Most of his colleagues from young Vilna were no longer around. They had been murdered at Panari, or they were refugees in Russia. He and his colleague Kaczerginski joined the Ghetto Underground, the United Partisan Organization. And there, Sutzkever devoted himself to the role of cultural organizer as a way to boost morale. He coordinated lectures, theater performances, poetry readings, and mentored the youth club. He was soon assigned to work with a group of other intellectuals and writers whose task was to sort through the vast bibliographic and archival holdings that the Nazis had gathered together from dozens of local and regional libraries. Their work was part of the German Reich's Rosenberg task force, which wanted to loot the most valuable items to display after the German victory. The mass of books and documents was a repository of the Jewish people's history, attesting to a religious and cultural heritage that extended back centuries. Every day, Sutzkever and his colleagues would be marched from the ghetto gates to the former headquarters of YIVO, the Jewish Scientific Institute, where many of those materials had been dumped. During long days of work, his comrades, knowing that he was a poet, allowed him moments of solitude from the sorting so that he could continue his writing. Even in wartime, the work of a poet was respected as its own form of communal service. And instead of following orders, Sutzkever joined the secret activities of what became known as the Paper Brigade, who took to hiding from Nazi hands and the paper mills the most priceless documents and books of the collection by smuggling them on their person back into the ghetto or to non-Jewish sympathizers for safekeeping. Their activities would have been a capital offense had they been discovered. Some of the group's rescued materials, which also included Sutzkever's own writings, were buried and retrieved after the war. Sutzkever's poetic output during the war included meta-poetic meditations about the role of poetry in extremis, confessional lyrics about private losses and humiliations, and poems attesting to the stamina of the ghetto's teachers and cultural activists and fighters. His most famous poems of the period, Teacher Mira, The Lead Plates of the Rome Press, A Wagon of Shoes, To My Child, Under Your White Stars, Farewell are the core works of the canon of Holocaust poetry in Yiddish. His lyrics were inspired by the reality that ghetto residents lived, but not beholden to it, writing as much to encourage others as to record. Now, I want to turn here to the question of the memoir itself that I began with. At a certain point, one of Sutzkever's poems that he writes in the ghetto is smuggled out of the ghetto with the destination of Yiddish poet Peretz Markish, who was then living in Moscow. Markish then shared it with Ilya Ehrenberg, who was one of the most famous Soviet Russian writers, who had it translated into Russian. It was one of the earliest accounts of the destruction of European Jewry to appear in the Soviet press. And despite the pressures of the moment, his verse retained its pre-war commitment to poetic precision by building on his belief in art as a counterforce to destruction. Several decades later, in the preface to an anthology of his writings, he observed about his writing that was smuggled out, "When the sun itself was transformed into ash, I believed with full confidence that so long as poetry did not abandon me, the bullet would not penetrate me." Days before the final liquidation of the ghetto in September 1943, Sutzkever and Friedke escaped the ghetto as part of a group of underground fighters. In the Narach forest, they joined up with a partisan unit. For the next 6 months, through a harsh winter, Sutzkever continued to write poetry and to record the unit's activities. When the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in Moscow, which Ilya Ehrenberg and Markish were members, when they were alerted to the fact that Sutzkever was alive in the forest, a rescue mission was put in place to retrieve them. His reputation made him a valuable symbol of Jewish sacrifice and the contribution to the struggle against fascism. Once in Moscow, we see a picture here with Friedke, Sutzkever sought out friendships with fellow Yiddish and Russian writers. His articles and radio broadcasts in the Soviet press about the fate of Vilna's Jews, and Ehrenberg's own article about him in Pravda in April 1944 transformed Sutzkever into one of the first public figures to provide an eyewitness account to the destruction of European Jewry, prompting readers and listeners to share their own stories with him as part of an early process of testimonial exchange. Fate would have it that the poet initially rejected from young Vilna for his lack of engagement was now looked to as representative of an entire people. And his 2 years in Moscow were feverish. He completed a Yiddish prose memoir of the ghetto that we'll talk about in a moment. He collected his wartime writings. He joined a committee of Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee members to gather materials for the so-called Black Book, which was to be an anthology of essays about the destruction of Jews in former Soviet territories, designed to indict fascist Germany that was later, unfortunately, censored by the Soviet regime. But first we run into a problem. Until now, scholars of Sutzkever paid scant attention to the memoir that I just finished translating, this memoir called From the Vilna Ghetto. Despite his reputation, and I've just described it, as the most important Yiddish poet witness to what would later become known as the Holocaust, and despite his standing as the leading literary figure of the post-war period of Yiddish letters, this memoir played no significant role in discussions of the author's oeuvre. One might even go so far as to say that Sutzkever himself erased his own memoir from public memory through purposeful neglect. He never sought out its republication or translation. And by ignoring it, he seemed to suggest that everything of value that he had to say about the destruction of European Jewry had been poured into his lyrics and symbolic prose. The prose memoir was a wartime relic, published in 1946, written in 1944, but one that he barely acknowledged. And only last October, on the 75th anniversary of its initial publication, and on the 75th anniversary of Sutzkever's own testimony at Nuremberg, and thanks to a Canadian university press, and thanks to support from the Canadian government, did we actually publish this document and are able to now revisit it in full. So we're faced, I want to suggest, with a paradox. On the one hand, one cannot doubt Sutzkever's deep investment, influence, and responsibility for developing a body of aesthetic literature that would serve as a permanent lieu de mémoire for his community of Vilna Jews, whose ashes were scattered in the forest of Ponar. Nor can we deny his self-fashioning as his community's representative voice. He would devote a significant portion of his time in the ghetto at great personal risk to developing a mythopoetics of resistance and to rescuing important documents. When his colleagues in Moscow learned that Sutzkever was still alive and living in the forest as a partisan, according to Sutzkever's own myth, they arranged with the Lithuanian president in exile for his rescue in March 1944. Nuremberg was especially eager to harness Sutzkever's experiences and voice to the cause of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Sutzkever negotiated his new role in response to two shifting landscapes. Imagine having been in the Vilna Ghetto for 2 years and then living in the forest for 6 months, and suddenly in the middle of the war, a plane comes to rescue a poet, and suddenly you find yourself in Moscow. And you find yourself surrounded by Yiddish writers and Russian writers. You found yourself surrounded and being brought into the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. So he has to negotiate his new role as witness to the complete destruction of his home community and as a partisan poet who's now publicly upheld as the face of Jewish heroism. To complicate matters, his nonpartisan sentiments, that is, the fact that he wasn't a communist before the war and certainly didn't become a communist during the war, necessitated that he navigate this new environment with care. These years would be a critical moment in Sutzkever's public transformation from the private poetic aesthete to this voice of a community. Only days after he and his wife arrived in Moscow, he was asked on April 2nd, 1944, to address a gathering of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee plenum, where he established himself both as a chronicler of destruction, as a witness to Jewish heroism, and as an outlet for Jewish rage. An excerpt from that speech was published in the Yiddish newspaper Einigkeit on April 6th, anticipating the imperative to definitively resist a narrative that Jews had been passive in going to their deaths. He wrote, "The whole world ought to know that in the woods of Lithuania and Belarusia, from which I have come, hundreds of Jewish partisans are fighting, proud avengers of the spilt blood of their brothers." Later that month, Nuremberg would publish an article about Sutzkever in Pravda, in Russian, called "The Triumph of a Human Being," that would introduce him to a much broader Soviet audience. Nuremberg's portrait of Sutzkever established a link between his Yiddish art and the resistance that it inspired. Sutzkever understood well both the expectations and limitations of writing in the Soviet Union. Not only had he been at the forefront of resisting pressure from local communists, but he also believed strongly in the cultural distinctiveness and national dignity of the Jews as a people. And he thought that that was yoked to Jewish artistry and to Jewish languages. On the other hand, in the wartime Soviet Union, Jewish suffering and bravery were promoted only so far as they contributed to the anti-fascist cause, not for the sake of Yiddish culture itself or for Jewish collective memory or identity. So we return to this paradox. One would assume that the only chronicle, the only memoir written by Sutzkever would figure prominently in his oeuvre, if not by him, then at least by his critics. How to explain its obscurity for the last 75 years? Well, when I approached several colleagues about my interest in publishing a translation of the Chronicle more than a decade ago, I was greeted with unexpected skepticism about the value of the project, and there were two reactions that figured prominently. First, colleagues suggested that the memoir is politically compromised due to its solicitation, its composition, its editing, and its publication in the Soviet Union. That is, they imposed, I think, I would argue, a certain Cold War skepticism about it. And those skeptics volunteered, to what extent could his ghetto memoir really be taken seriously, written under the watchful eyes of a censor by a writer who might have been eager to please his rescuers and to secure his new position in Moscow? To what extent was its composition perhaps a fragile negotiation between their expectations and the political need of his patrons for a hero model? In short, to what extent did the memoir serve perhaps imperatives that were not Sutzkever's own imperatives? Another group of scholars suggested that perhaps Sutzkever was compelled to write the memoir as a detour into prose in order to meet the expectations of the moment, even if it was not his literary priority. And despite the fact that much later he would insist that everything he had to say about the destruction of Vilna could be found in his poetry. This would naturally lead to a second hesitation, that translating the memoir for a wider audience might diminish Sutzkever's literary reputation. Did the memoir not exist in artistic tension, perhaps even undercut what he had so meticulously crafted in his lyrics? What seemed to nag at my interlocutors was the memoir's seeming journalistic accounting of his experiences, as a chronicle written in spare prose, almost breathless haste in the immediate aftermath of his return from liberated Vilna in July 1944, borrowing from the Soviet conventions of reportage. His poetry, some argued, communicates so much more experience. And they also ask why the volume doesn't focus on the partisan experience. His 6 months as a partisan, why only focus on the ghetto? Why does it say so little about the context for and composition of his poems? Why does he not cite from any of his poems? And I would suggest that rather than exploring the memoir on its own terms as one of the earliest full-length Yiddish memoirs of a Jewish ghetto to ever be published, it was more convenient to dismiss it for not fulfilling our own desires, rather than for what it revealed about the act of writing in such close proximity to the events that we didn't even have a term that we have now known as Holocaust. That is, the memoir exists before there's such a thing as Holocaust history, before there's such a thing as Holocaust memory, at the very edge of those things, at the very precipice of those things beginning, and at the very precipice of the war ending. So let's turn to the chronicle itself, the memoir itself. This ghetto memoir is composed in 4 parts, covering a period of exactly 3 years. It moves chronologically, opening with the German attack on Soviet-controlled Vilnius as part of Operation Barbarossa, and ends with the author's return to the city from Moscow after its liberation in July 1944. Its first and its fourth sections really focus on gathering testimony from eyewitnesses, and also focus on a neat literary convention that scholars of Holocaust literature have long observed, that witnesses to the final solution tend to telescope in on the initial moments of Nazi occupation, that is the shock of occupation, and also telescope in on the liberation, that is the relief and the reckoning. Its middle 2 sections also conform to that same convention. They telescope out for a more synthetic investigation of the long period of existence between those 2 poles. So its 2 longer middle sections concentrate on the internal organization and sociocultural life of the Vilna Ghetto and on the partisan organization. In terms of space, then, the memoir privileges expressions of what we might call organizational, cultural, and armed resistance in an attempt to craft a narrative of ghetto life as a balance against the chronicle of destruction that overwhelms its 4th and final sections. Since these models of communal endurance are bookended by sections on murder, humiliation, and ultimately annihilation, the memoir is haunted by an unreconcilable tension, namely that the cultural and physical resistance in which Sutzkever himself was so deeply invested had proved unable to save most of Vilna Jewry, including his infant child and his mother. In one of the memoir's penultimate scenes, this tension is realized as Sutzkever and his partisan comrades dig up treasures that they had buried in a ghetto hiding spot prior to its liquidation. And he writes, "We came to one of the most important hiding places. There we found posters of the ghetto theater performances, a box of letters by the Yiddish writer Shalom Aleichem, manuscripts by the Hebrew poet Bialik, by Gorky, and by Yiddish poets Yehoyash and Yiddish writer Mendele. In a corner, we found sculptures, most rescued by the Ansky Museum, from the Ansky Museum. And in the obscurity, we saw a bust of the head of Tolstoy by Ilya Ginsberg. While digging out Antokolsky's sculpture of King David, we suddenly saw an arm. My body froze. It was not part of the plaster statue. One of the Jews who had been hiding in the city's hideout had been buried next to the sculpture." So we see here that the relief that their dangerous work had managed to preserve some of Vilna's sacred treasures, with the grotesque reminder of the ultimate fate of his fellow townsmen, resisted mythologizing in prose. Personal and cultural survival is rendered small in comparison to the fate of tens of thousands of others. Moreover, we note that the memoir doesn't offer any overview of pre-war Vilna or its place in Jewish life. Its role as the former Jerusalem of Lithuania was of no particular interest to the Soviet sponsors of the Black Book that solicited the memoir. That the full and rich spectrum of Jewish institutional, educational, religious, and cultural life that was Vilna is not discussed at all in the memoir, suggests a memoir in which there are two competing expectations built in. First, there's a Soviet or universalist standpoint, suggesting that the guiding goal of the memoir is not the destruction of Vilna as a Jewish cultural and demographic space, but rather to accentuate the Jews as victims and as resistors to fascism more broadly. On the other hand, from a Jewish, or what we might call a particularistic standpoint, the memoir takes the reputation of Vilna for granted among Yiddish readers. It assumes thick cultural knowledge, allowing the text to jump directly into the wartime action without having to explain what Vilna represented, what it was, what it had been. So in the Soviet context of the memoir, the Soviets did not ask Sutzkever to evaluate what the destruction meant to the Jewish world. Rather, readers would have to suffice with descriptions of exactly what happened, and from them imply historical and cultural meaning. Sutzkever was also hypersensitive about finding the proper balance in his chronicle between personal and collective experience, between his own fate as a well-known poet and that of the majority of his community. There was an expectation that he served the anti-fascist cause through his writing. After all, he was rescued because he was a writer. And Sutzkever intuitively understood the need to tread carefully. If the ghetto lyrics he was editing in Moscow and the Holocaust epic he was beginning to craft served the higher Jewish need for a mythopoetics of Jewish catastrophe, to satisfy his hosts, he would have to write something very different, something straightforward, borrowing a page from Ehrenberg's own wartime reporting. He would have to, in his own words, quote, learn to write Soviet, end quote. So as Vilna, I think that I want to argue that Sutzkever's Vilna Ghetto should be appreciated as one of the very early attempts at translating oral testimony into prose, in which a writer serves as both address, editor, and disseminator of the witnessing of others. As the memoir progresses, its focus moves from individual experiences to collective fate by providing increased space to the voices of the survivor witnesses he encounters. And by the final section, it's almost overwhelming. His individual voice, his I, is subsumed by an entire chapter of firsthand eyewitness accounts. It's almost relentless in this regard, as the subsection title suggests. Frumme Rivka Lit Borstein, an 80-year-old woman, told me. Zelig Levin recounts. Itzik Dogim, who escaped from Ponar, tells me of the open pits. He functions here as the intimate, trusted recipient of testimony and as distiller and archivist of collective memory. And in so doing, the memoir becomes one of those early attempts to create a polyvocal Holocaust testimony. It's not so much his chronicle of the ghetto as an attempt to forge a collective text of witnessing in recognition that the experience of any one individual, even that of Sutzkever, would be too limiting to communicate the full scope of national trauma. Indeed, Sutzkever's memoir seems less interested in exposing the self than in functioning as an evidentiary document. And as an evidentiary document, the memoir sees itself as responsible not only for narrating Nazi crimes, but also for naming specific perpetrators. Not unrelated, the chronicle carefully eschews moral judgment of Jewish actions, be they those of the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, or the Jewish underground, or the Jewish police, or even of ordinary Jews. The worst he can say is something about the Jewish police in a very spare line about, quote, having nothing positive to say. Even when it comes to his own participation with specific initiatives or groups, there's little evaluation of their actions. For instance, in evaluating his role as literary organizer of the Ghetto Theater, and here we see two posters of the Ghetto Theater, he makes no mention of the broader controversy over the appropriateness of, quote, performing theater in a graveyard, as Bundist socialist leaflets had accused. In his discussion of the partisan organization, there's no effort to judge the effectiveness of its strategies. The closest he comes to collective self-critique is when he warns future readers that, quote, those present at the moment could not always judge things rationally. In short, since the liquidation of Vilna Jewry was total, Sutzkever was unwilling in the summer of 1944 to evaluate decisions made in extremis. Such judgment would be a perverse diversion from the real perpetrators. The task of rebuilding the Jewish people and bringing Nazi criminals to justice would have to take priority. Perhaps the most important aspect of the memoir is the degree to which Sutzkever conflated armed resistance and cultural expression in the ghetto into a single resistance struggle. Since Sutzkever himself saw himself as the embodiment of this dual reality as both a partisan and a poet, and since he had significant investment in both those worlds, the chronicle doesn't limit his understanding of resistance to armed struggle. In fact, it offers dozens of pages about cultural resilience of Vilna Jewry in wartime, from its literary evenings to its theater, from its schools to its libraries, from its youth clubs to its child prodigies, from its mathematicians to its opera star. His own contributions to these activities are mentioned, but they're severely downplayed. For instance, his organization of an evening in the ghetto dedicated to the poetry of young Vilna isn't mentioned. His receipt of first prize in a literary competition in the ghetto is limited to a single line. Accounts of his own successes as a cultural organizer are restrained to an extreme. The underlying thrust is to offer this collective rather than personal experience of communal life in extremis. The chronicle here, I want to suggest, anticipates later debates about the degree to which the rich cultural life in the ghetto either contributed to or distracted its inhabitants from the very real dangers that lay before them. Categories of perpetrator and rescuer and victim are neat and somewhat uncomplicated, and cultural heroism is presented alongside partisan armed struggle as providing dignity and maintaining moral poise. The chronicle also anticipated several trends in Holocaust studies that would not emerge until decades after the events, and I'll cite just two examples for you. First, given that it was composed to reflect the new vocabulary and internal grammar of ghetto life, it represented an important early effort to offer a new lexicon of experience. Terms such as malines or chapuns were not familiar to readers beyond the ghetto in 1944, and Sutzkever goes to great efforts to begin assembling a new Yiddish language of occupation and ghettoization, and to investigate the ways in which it transformed Yiddish itself. This significantly influenced my decisions as a translator. Since Sutzkever wrote the book for a Yiddish-speaking readership, at a moment in history when Yiddish place names had literally been wiped off the map, I sought to produce a translation that respected the city's Yiddish toponymy. It's important to remember that Jewish geography is not only about material space, but also reflects political and psychic claims and conditions registered in language. So in order to provide a sense of the way Sutzkever and his fellow Vilna natives navigated and would then reconstruct Yiddish Vilna, I elected to retain Sutzkever's Yiddish names for most streets and neighborhoods and regional locations. And although some scholars and translators have used the official pre-war Polish names when writing about wartime Vilna, I find such usages anachronistic for a period when the city was no longer under Polish rule. Moreover, Sutzkever's Yiddish place names remind us of how he consciously deployed them to claim urban space for Jewish collective memory. In that way, I think the translation not only transmits the facts of ghetto life, but also that it was experienced in Yiddish. Second, Sutzkever's memoir is significant for the attention it provides to the role of women in the ghetto, and especially in the resistance. It notes acts of spiritual and cultural steadfastness, as when his mother continues blessing the Sabbath candles even when a Nazi collaborator bursts into her home, or when the opera singer Luba Levitsky trains for an opera at the ghetto theater, but is captured and tortured only hours before she's scheduled to take the stage. Or where, as in the previous side, the teacher Mira Bernstein protects her students during a nighttime raid. He's in awe of women who give birth in the ghetto and nurse their infants in secret. He points out gestures of selflessness that could have cost non-Jewish women their lives, such as in his description of his rescuer Yanova Bartoshevich, taking him into her home and smuggling bread to his wife and mother in the ghetto, or the mother superior who hid Abba Kovner and others in her convent and supplied them with weapons, or the Lithuanian librarian Oina Shemaite, who hid Jewish books and archival materials and came into the ghetto to celebrate May Day with Jewish citizens of Vilna, all of whom offered models of solidarity. And in the memoir's third section on the partisans, he pauses to acknowledge the bravery of women fighters, such as Wittke Kempner, who participated in the first partisan organization against German occupation forces. Both the Moscow and Paris editions feature photographs, as I showed you, of these women partisan fighters in order to emphasize their contributions. And in these ways, his memoir provides a preliminary framework for the study of gender and the Holocaust, and especially different manifestations of women's resistance. The proximity of the chronicle's composition to Sutzkever's personal losses also results in a complicated tension between self-restraint and expressions of revenge. The greater the distance between Holocaust literature and the events it describes, the more philosophical its ruminations will become. But the language of survival and even the moral category of survivor didn't yet exist when Sutzkever sat down to pen his ghetto recollections. So the events that happened to him directly really needed to be written with composure. He doesn't write of revenge when he's forced to dance naked about a bonfire and desecrate a Torah scroll. He doesn't rage with a desire for vengeance when describing news of his mother's disappearance or of his infant son's murder. Rather, in the memoir, Sutzkever maintains his composure through a strategy of deflection, allowing other survivor witnesses or found documents that he includes in the memoir to call out for revenge, as when he visits the Gestapo jail where the United Partisan Organization leader Wittenberg was incarcerated, and there sees on the wall, written in blood, "Avenge us." Here he may already have been attempting to craft a usable past. His memoir is helpful in reminding us that expressions of revenge were common in Yiddish sources composed for Jewish readers in ways that post-Holocaust literature written in non-Jewish languages was not, often for reasons of decorum. Sutzkever's memoir also provided a preliminary visual narrative of the Holocaust through its inclusion of photography. When it was published in 1946, remember, there was not yet an established visual canon to guide the work of historical memory. The choice of photographs served as both evidentiary and narrative, a narrative function as well. So on the one hand, photographs of Nazi orders or of the mass murderers or of burned bodies at Ponar, those were evidentiary, concrete evidence of their crimes, whereas other photographs that focused on the cultural and armed resistance worked in synergy, showing that those things supported one another. Finally, the shifting political landscapes in Moscow dictated changes while Sutzkever readied his account for publication. Most notably, a report issued on the 24th of February, 1945, that advised the Black Book's editors to remove materials that might indict Lithuanian, Ukrainian, or other collaborators with the Nazis. The head of the Soviet Information Bureau instructed that such materials would minimize the strength of the main accusation against the Germans, which needed to remain the central and decisive mission of the book. And even earlier, in October 1944, Ilya Ehrenberg raised concern and finally quit the project in fury. He wrote to Sutzkever informing him that the Black Book Literary Commission had stopped its work and advised him that he could use the materials he had composed under its auspices as you see fit. This eventually led to its publication as a standalone volume. So we should be careful to evaluate the Chronicle for what it is rather than what it is not. And on its own aesthetic terms, it's a riveting and moving polyvocal text. What we might see as an aesthetic of absence or of restraint is also an aesthetic that has its own power. And all memoir is a construction of the self at a particular moment that should be unpacked as such. If his poetry served the angels of art, memoir would serve the lords of memory. Finally, the volume also includes 3 later reminiscences that I included about his close colleague Ilya Ehrenberg, about the poet Peretz Markish, and about the Yiddish actor and director Michols. Together, they provide a glimpse into his 2 years in Moscow and into the political and social contest in which he had to compose this chronicle. These intimate portraits reveal Sutzkever's personal admiration for those who arranged his rescue, but also the limits of Yiddish self-expression under the watchful eyes of the authorities. That many of those friends in Moscow would themselves later be betrayed by Stalinism situates the memoir precisely at a moment in which he was reflecting back at the monstrosity of one totalitarian movement, while also navigating the possibilities for a Jewish creative future, acutely aware of the murderous history of purges in the late 1930 under the Soviet Union, and the fact that his gut told him that those would not necessarily have ended when the war ended. And he writes finally of revenge. This is a really interesting moment that I want to quote here. he writes of going to Ilya Ehrenberg before going to the testimony that I started out this talk with, before going to Nuremberg. And he writes the following: in the nightmarish days before I flew to the trial in Nuremberg, a fascinating thought occurred to me. Shoot Goering at the trial. Since I still had my revolver from my time in the forest, along with 6 bullets, I could bring it with me. And according to Ehrenberg, aside from the marshal who was stationed next to the accused, I was under the impression it was possible to get within a meter of the German defendants. I was possessed by the idea as if by a dibuk, and there was no Rebbe in Moscow to exercise it. With every minute, it took more concrete form. I didn't confide my plan to anyone. And in the end, I decided to probe Ehrenberg's soul. Very carefully, as if I was speaking regular words without any, special intention, I said to him, "You know what I'm thinking, Ilya Grigorevich? Isn't there a witness set to appear in Nuremberg who could shoot Goering?" Ehrenberg measured me with the penetrating wisdom of his glance. I don't know whether he completely understood what I was getting at, but he felt that I was up to something. And he responded calmly with long, drawn-out symbols. "If you, for instance, Avrom Gertsevich, were to do such a thing, what would you accomplish? Nobody would believe you that you shot Goering at your own initiative. The Russians would accuse you of having perpetrated the act at the request of the Americans, and the Americans would contend that you carried out a Russian order. Don't forget, now you're a Soviet citizen." His answer disarmed me. I didn't bring the revolver and the 6 bullets with me to the Nuremberg trial. A Yiddish poet taking revenge on a German supreme commander was not to be. So I'm happy to take some of your questions. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak at the University of Alberta and with the broader community in Edmonton, and even more broadly, since of course all of these talks go worldwide. And thank you for your attention and being willing to listen to the work that I've been doing for the past number of years.
Well, thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. I'll jump in and echo your call out to the audience, and to remind the viewers of this talk to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And as the questions populate, then I will share them. I had wanted to say I envy your students. It was fascinating, and I can't believe how quickly the time passed. So
Thank you.
It's just wonderful. I mean, yeah, really interesting. And I'll take advantage of my situation here, since I'm the only one with a microphone on and a camera on, if I can. It's something that a topic I know virtually nothing about, but and was frantically making notes. Most of them are incoherent. But I had a question sort of early on that's kind of a bit of a dumb question, and that was, I wondered how much, if any, of Sutzkever's early testimony, you were talking about that earlier on, the stuff that was sort of leaking back to Moscow, and then when he finally arrived back in Moscow, how much, if any, of that made it to the West? I know, and because you were talking too about the fact this is before there is even a conception of the Holocaust or
Right.
or the history of the Holocaust or anything like that. But of course there is a rather sort of dark history of this information leaking through to the Allies, and it not
Right.
not being acted on. And I wonder, since he's, I mean, you make a case for him as such an important
Right.
documentarian of this. Does any of it make it to the West prior to Nuremberg?
Prior to Nuremberg, for sure, because the West is, certainly spies and other authorities are reading what's being published in the Soviet press. Before Nuremberg, before 1946, for sure. Probably not while he's still in the ghetto up through 1943. Some of that's leaking out very slowly to Moscow, but his own works are mainly poetry. By the time he arrives in Moscow in 1944, he's not only writing the memoir, but he's trying to publish things in New York. So by then, things are being known late 44, beginning 1945, that work is getting out, but much too late for the West to be able to really do anything significant. in that sense. I mean, I think much of that focus, we have to forget, we can't forget, so much of our focus is on the role of the allies, the Western allies in fighting and winning the war. And we forget the major role of the Soviet Union and the Red Army in contributing to that victory. And most of that attention, since Vilna was really just across the border from the Soviet Union, was to try to get word out to the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in Moscow to sort of promote that cause within broader circles there.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for entertaining that question. There's a question in the Q&A, but I'll just, if I can, I'm just astonished by the character of Sutzkever, and the fact that it just seems like, I mean, you spoke a lot about, you used the word tensions quite a bit, which is it feels like his whole experience is really sort of in a state of tension. And you mentioned, paradoxes as well. And I'm sort of trying to jot them down as I went along, this notion of, I guess you started sort of talking about, a modernist Yiddish poet who's disregarded for being insufficiently engaged with Jewishness and Yiddishness, and yet, paradoxically emerges as this monumentally important figure who seems to spend an awful lot of time, sort of diminishing his own monumentality, writing a memoir that you said is, a memoir that's not about the self in a sense, which is sort of very contradictory. And then this ridiculous circumstance of being trapped between two sort of different and converging forms of totalitarianism, and having to make a kind of a Hobson's choice in a sense. And then at the end of it, as this anecdote you're talking about shooting Goering, that he finds himself yet again, it's like, what do you do? That you might undertake this kind of act of revenge, a moral, a sort of a decisively moral act in some way on behalf of your people, only to find that your action is, that it's politicized, and your agency is taken away from you. And I'm not sure I just wondered if you could talk about that a little more, because it's a person who you would think at every turn, by all rights, should have sort of given up.
Right.
In a way.
So I think that's the most fascinating question, because our assumption would be that those before the war who were most ideologically engaged would be those who become the voices of the community, and those who are the most crystalline, the most aestheticized, would be the ones who would be overwhelmed by the experience. And what we find here is the exact opposite. And I think what's interesting is that for those who are ideologically engaged before the war, very quickly they realize that the world has betrayed them and their ideology means nothing, that it's all transient, right? Yeah. For Sutzkever, who already had a belief in poetry, his standard could not be betrayed. No matter what the Germans did, his standard of art remained pure. So he has this pure realm to which he can retreat that isn't made impure by ideological, the ideological whims or inefficacies of the moment. So that's one thing that I would say. And I think that after the war, I've only told a snippet of a career, right? It's hard to believe that all of this is happening when he's a young 30-something-year-old. So we talked about his years in the 1930s, when he's in his 20s, and his ghetto years in the 30s. But he makes a political decision very soon after the war. He recognizes what Stalinism is all about. He leaves the Soviet Union, where he could have been established, and he probably would have been murdered, because everyone he associated with in the Soviet Union and the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, except for Nuremberg, were murdered by 1952. And he decides that the only place for a Yiddish poet, and here's another great paradox, was in the Hebrew-speaking land of Israel. That is, to be, even without Yiddish being the all-encompassing world that it was there, it was more important for him to be living among Jews and to be living in a place where at least they were functioning in another Jewish language. That was enough for a Jewish poet, even if that language was no longer Yiddish and was now Hebrew. And as soon as he gets to Tel Aviv in 1947, just before the state is declared, he founds a journal within months of his arrival, already during the War of Independence there, called the Goldene Kate, the Golden Chain, which he names after a play, a famous play written by a turn-of-the-century Yiddish poet by the name of Peretz, essentially saying that he is now adding a new rung into this chain. And in the same way that Paris was from Warsaw and he had been from Vilna, that chain will now be Tel Aviv. And for the next 50 years, 60 years, he writes Yiddish poetry and edits this journal in Tel Aviv. So the remarkable thing is, after being a Polish poet and after being for 2 years a Russian Yiddish writer, he becomes an Israeli Yiddish writer. And to me, this is, a fascinating way of sort of reinventing oneself in different landscapes, but maintaining sort of a standard that never really deviates from when he was an 18-year-old and swore that oath that I talked about.
Yeah. Oh, it's an amazing story, and thank you for thanks for entertaining my question.
Sure.
And I hope, I'm thinking about your the colleagues you described as being ambivalent about the project. I hope they've had a change of heart.
Well, you know professors, right?
I do indeed.
Some of them may not, but no, I have good colleagues and very supportive ones at that.
Well, super. I'm going to jump into the Q&A because I see it's populating, and we'll see what we can do. So you have a very nice comment from one of the members of the Reichert committee saying your lecture was riveting. A question: did you find any especially difficult aspects of translating his Yiddish?
His Yiddish is actually very clear. Yiddish, by the time he was writing it, had been standardized. The challenge was that in the Soviet version, he was writing using Soviet Yiddish orthography, which takes some getting used to, but and then the Paris version is sort of a different type of orthography. The challenge was that the versions are different. So I had to look at two different versions of the same memoir and then synthesize them to produce a critical edition. And that in the translation, you can see where there's things that appear in the Soviet version that weren't in the French, things that appear in the French that weren't in the Soviet. So that was one challenge. I think that the main challenge wasn't in translating his Yiddish, but figuring out how to mediate working on a document like this while also, living a life and trying to, be a good parent and good husband and not allowing sort of the dark material to overwhelm you. So very early on, I resolved, I'm an early riser, so I resolved to only translate in the morning, only usually when it was dark, certainly before my children woke up. And then, no matter where I was, I would put it aside and then I'd begin my day. But the real challenges of the memoir were discovering things that even when you're a Holocaust scholar, you don't necessarily anticipate, you don't know. Right. So much, so many of us are used to thinking about the Holocaust in the context of Auschwitz, right, as the paradigmatic space. We don't necessarily think, although I think scholarship in recent years has informed us about this sort of the notion of the Holocaust of bullets that's been introduced by other scholars, right? This idea that not all the Jews were gassed. There were many Jews who were shot in pits within proximity to their homes, especially those on the other side of the line that in former Soviet territory. So reading those descriptions and then the descriptions of sort of how those bodies were then dealt with and sort of the mechanical nature of trying to get rid of evidence was, even to me, I was like, it takes quite the imagination to come up with a process like that. So those were some of the challenges in working through it and sort of making sure that I got it right. I was told early on, you're dealing with not only with Sutzkever, but you're dealing with a topic. You don't want to screw it up, right? So I was doubly careful in checking with colleagues who might know, and I had a lot of questions. And thankfully, we're a generous field.
Well, thank you for talking about something that I think it's certainly a question that I always have, and I think a lot of people probably listening have, and that is for scholars like yourself who are working with scholars of the Holocaust, and especially working with material like memoir that is deeply personal and has an immediacy that's quite different from sort of broader historical surveys. It is that question of yeah, how do you hang on to how do you stay in the light, so to say. So
Indeed.
thanks for sharing that with us. Um, a question, wondering if you have any comment on Paul Kagan's memoir, one of the few from start of the war to the end of the ghetto.
So I just saw that comment. I don't. I try to only speak about things that I've really thought carefully about. So of course I know the memoir, but I haven't thought about it enough to be able to put it into comparative perspective in ways that I think would, be helpful to the audience. So my apologies on that.
No, no worries. A question about Yiddish language. Many Yiddish language proponents flat out rejected the Hebrew language. Did Sutzkever advocate at all against the choice of Hebrew as the official language of the state of
No,
Israel?
no, he didn't. Not at all. He knew where he was going. His brother had been a Zionist and had been there already since the 20s. So he was well aware. He knew Hebrew. He'd been educated in a Hebrew Polish school, so he was fluent in Hebrew as well. He certainly wrote poems by the time he got to Israel, especially in the 50s, talking about the sort of strange nature of having been a poet in sort of this vast spoken language that now suddenly is just swallowed up by the earth, and sort of people asking him, well, why don't you just start writing Hebrew poems? You'll have so many more readers. And he writes in one of those poems in one line, shall I translate myself alive? Like, how does one,
Yeah.
some writers can write in a different language, but his artistic tool was Yiddish, and he didn't deviate from that. And although he had really strong Hebrew translators, he remained essentially, except through a group, people who really knew, anonymous in Israel. That is, he was much better known outside of Israel than he was in Israel. And in addition to this memoir that was translated and published recently, there have been two films that have come out, one by the National Yiddish Book Center about his life, and another produced in Israel, originally in Hebrew. And in that film, the preeminent scholar of Hebrew literature, Dan Miron, is interviewed, and he says the most amazing thing about Sutzkever is that he was the most important Israeli poet of the last 50 years, and no one knows him.
Yeah.
So complete anonymity,
Well,
which also made it exciting to work on him. I mean, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and you talked about being a teacher. I benefited from wonderful teachers, and I remember, as an undergraduate at McGill, not knowing, anything about Yiddish, not knowing anything about Sutzkever, not knowing anything about this period, to be honest, and sort of just being introduced to this character in passing in a course, and sort of that's enough to ignite one's imagination and eventually redirect one's career. So we never know what we're teaching or when will have an effect on a student and will change their way of thinking about a specific question or even career choice. So that to the extent that students respond to this type of narrative is gratifying, and also I think suggests that he has something to say, still has something to say.
Yeah, absolutely. What a ridiculous, it continues to be ridiculous, this idea, as now you're saying, that he's such an important figure in Jewish history and Jewish cultural
Right.
history, and yet there he is, sort of in Israel, largely unknown. It's just that's irony piled on top of irony. But I can only imagine, as a scholar, having the opportunity to work on a figure like this, who's as I think I said, as we've been saying, who's monumental, and yet is just sort of requiring this work to be done, to be
Yeah,
uncovered.
and we're very lucky that he gave his archives to the National Library of Israel. So we have a lot of materials there that scholars can work on. And it's been a really great opportunity for me to also bridge sort of two worlds, right? The world of the past, the world of Yiddish, the world of Eastern Europe, that then brings me to be able to do work in Israel with other scholars of the Jewish world in all different types of places. And to me, that's very exciting to be able to have that opportunity to work at the intersection of languages, at the intersection of Jewish experiences, at the intersection of diasporism and statism. All of these things sort of come together neatly.
Yeah, well, that's very nice. a question about the Jews of Lithuania. The question is asking about 90 to 95% of Jewish Lithuania perished in the Holocaust, with only one synagogue remaining in Vilna. Is that?
That's true. There's only the choral synagogue remains and is the only functioning synagogue in Vilna. And the city had, depends on what we call a synagogue, but it had hundreds of synagogues, prayer houses, shtibbles, kloisen, however we want to describe them. None of them exist anymore. And it's also true that Lithuanian Jewry has one of the highest percentages of all Jewries in Europe that were destroyed, and were destroyed rather quickly in the immediate aftermath of Operation Barbarossa.
A biographical question. Did Sutzkever have any more children?
He did. He had two daughters, and they have children, or one of them has children, and the daughter, the granddaughter, Hadass Calderon, is one of the people who sort of is now working on her grandfather's legacy and is featured in both of these films, and also in the 60 Minutes segment, if my memory serves me correctly, is sort of this agent, going back to sort of the Israeli context, sort of the granddaughter who grows up with a grandfather who may be the most famous Yiddish poet of the 20th century, but who doesn't grow up speaking any Yiddish because no one teaches it to her, and now has to try to gain access to that legacy, all in translation, all through the help of other scholars, and how frustrating that is to sort of having gone through that world where the priorities were to build a state, to establish Hebrew, to do all these things that may have been necessary, but sort of what was missed. And to a certain extent, she now is part of that second generation that will be the third generation that sort of will have to do the linguistic and historical memory recuperation that will now allow them to go back to where they came from in order to go forward as modern Israelis.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about a literary question, I guess. It's about a specific poem. Is it Wagon of Shoes? Wagon of Shoes. Was it related to finding his mother's shoes after she was killed?
So a lot, we have to remember that a lot of Sutzkever's poems are inspired by reality, but aren't beholden to it. So he does have one of his most famous poems, a Vogenschich, is about seeing his mother's Sabbath shoes on a wagon and sort of ruminating on all these shoes that no longer have feet in them, right? Whether they were his actual mother's shoes or a pair of shoes that look like his mother's shoes, we can't necessarily know, and he won't reveal. In the same way that he has a famous poem called The Lead Plates of the Rome Press, in which he imagines the partisans going in and taking all of the plates that printed the famous edition of the Vilna Talmud and melting down each letter in order to make bullets to fight the Nazis. Famous poem, great poem, didn't happen. The lead plates were sold by the Nazis and melted down. They were not used by the partisans to make bullets, but it doesn't make the poem any less true, right? It depends on how we define truth. It may not be the reality, but the truth of the poem inspired thousands. So it took on a truth of its own. And I think the same thing with the Wagon of Shoes.
Okay, wonderful. There is a question from Paul Caitlin's son, Leon. Hello, Leon.
Hey.
And he says, thank you for your work, and that he is a Holocaust educator for high school students. And he asks, what do you think is the most important aspect of Sutzkever's work that might enlighten students who are really only beginning to learn about the Holocaust?
Well, I think one of the things that I always try to do when teaching Sutzkever is to embed what he's doing in the war with what he was doing before the war. Sort of to write around that. And really something that we didn't touch on as much, I started out our discussion at the beginning with his desire to testify at Nuremberg in Yiddish. And he ends up being forced to testify in Russian because Yiddish isn't one of the official languages of the court. Official languages of the court are English and Russian, French, I think, due to the Allies, and German. Yiddish isn't there, and they can't find a translator, and they don't really want to. So he has all of these important things to say in his mother tongue, in which he's most comfortable, about a community that spoke Yiddish, and he's forced to speak in Russian. He's only just arrived in Moscow, a year and a half earlier. So to me, Sutzkever can be an entry into the world of Yiddish itself, which I think is really important to not only talking about when we're doing Holocaust education about what happened to the Jews, but how the Jews spoke and wrote and thought about themselves. And to emphasize, at least in the Eastern European context, that much of this, not all of it, but much of it was done in Yiddish, that on the eve of 1939 was the most spoken Jewish language in all of Jewish history. And I think people forget that it wasn't the language that we now have of it, of grandmothers, of aging people, of survivors, of Holocaust victims, of martyrdom. It was the language of radical politics, of poetic experimentation, of modernism, of art, of everything that you can imagine. So to use Sutzkever as a way to talk about writing about the Holocaust, but also of a commitment to a language and what language represents, to me is very generative, and students seem to respond to that.
Sure. Thanks, Leon, for the question. I wonder too whether this thinking about Sutzkever and this story as a teaching tool. You mentioned earlier the fact that it's important to remember that the Holocaust was not a function of a handful of camps in Poland and Germany, but rather that there are events and there are stories all over Europe, obviously, and that maybe our access to knowledge about this particular region is probably in a North American context, I guess, is limited.
Right.
In some ways that we can gain more ready access to Holocaust history and narratives about the Holocaust in the Western European context, or
right. I mean, just think about the paradigmatic texts in the West and thinking about the Holocaust, or Anne Frank, right? So Dutch Jewry, Primo Levi, Italian Jewry.
Sure.
So texts written in Yiddish or Hebrew or Polish or Russian, of course, there are many of them, but they tend to not be as important in our focus. So this is also a way to reorient our focus further to the east. And I think it's also a way, when we think of Primo Levi's philosophical work, and when we think of Anne Frank and sort of that famous line about "I still believe in people despite everything," we don't find any of that in Sutzkever. I mean, he's just angry, writing about death, murder, insanity, humiliation. That is, it's not sanitized for a Western readership.
Right.
It's written for an internal Yiddish survivor community that's thirsty for knowledge about what happened and will be exported throughout the Yiddish-speaking world. So he can be quite blunt about it. He's not looking to sell books. He's looking to fulfill a certain responsibility. Now, Anne Frank also wasn't looking, of course, to sell books, but she was writing a diary. And I think that diary that she edited and rewrote, so clearly it wasn't just a diary, it was, she looked at it on her own as a work of art, but also was focused on a totally different point of origin, right? She was already an assimilated Western European Jew who was coming to terms with sort of what it meant to suddenly now be put back into a Jewish world. So Sutzkever was so deeply enmeshed in a Jewish world that there was no thought in his writing about suddenly, oh my God, I'm being ghettoized because I'm a Jew and I have to now discover all the. I mean, he from the birth was sort of in this world. So the texture of it is so different than what we might find in different Holocaust texts that we might be more used to.
Yeah, there's a curious, another curious tension, it seems, between the sort of the romanticizing of experience, and Frank isn't romanticizing her experience either, obviously, but the idea of sort of capturing and expressing experience through poetry.
Right.
It's kind of innately romantic, and yet Sutzkever seems to be putting that into tension too, because the poetry, an important function of the poetry is testimony, as you're saying, that he's saying, everything that he has to say is in the poetry. And so our tendency might be to think of poetry. I'm thinking, I'm a musicologist, and I've done a little bit of work on Gideon Klein and music the music that he composed in Theresienstadt, and you know, whether that music, whether music in that context constitutes a kind of a form of witnessing or not. And I was really struck by what you said about the idea that, you know, that a cultural flowering can also have this sort of dark side as well, that it detracts. But
so we already have a topic, Alex, for if I ever make it out in person
there you go.
to Alberta, because I'll talk about my grandmother's archive of Theresienstadt.
Okay.
Then we can have a conversation about material culture and documentary culture. It'll be an opportunity to continue the conversation.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks for that. We'll just a couple of comments here, and then I think we'll wrap up. A question, if you have any comment on, looks like Chava, is it Chava Rosenberg at and her daughter Goldie, who is at U of Lethbridge.
Yes, of course.
Yep.
So I know Goldie and was on a panel with her, and Goldie's done such amazing work in making sure that her mother's legacy remains strong. Chava Rosenfarb is not only perhaps the most, I would argue, the most important prose Yiddish writer, imaginative of the Holocaust. Her book, Tree of Life, more than 1,000 pages in English, is just this amazing text of the Vilna Ghetto. And another volume that was translated, also published by a Canadian press, called Survivors, with short stories, really incredible writing. So any of you who haven't read Chava Rosenfarb should go and read her, run to the library or order those books. And Goldie Morgenthaler has been sort of at the forefront of helping translate those books and also bring them to a broader reading public. The Rosenfarb's essays, if I'm not mistaken, were also translated by Goldie and were also published by McGill Queen's University Press and are available.
Thank you for that. A comment, I think, that just goes back to this question of Yiddish in Israel, noting that it's common that each generation speaks a different language.
Right. Yeah, I mean they do, and part of the excitement of working in Yiddish is that for years it was let's say a field that was rather small, and suddenly a lot of young people are interested in Yiddish for a variety of political and artistic reasons. So one of the things that I do, you know, one of the side gigs that I do that I consider most important is helping to teach and helping to direct a Yiddish language program at Tel Aviv University every summer, an international Yiddish program. And to me, it's really fascinating to teach Yiddish in a Hebrew-speaking university in, you know, ostensibly the first Hebrew-speaking city. But of course, once you start to do that, you recuperate all of these hidden and not so hidden Yiddish histories of Tel Aviv. That is, it's not that there's a master history, but then there's the lived reality, the vernacular history. The vernacular history is that Yiddish had, apart from New York and Montreal, more survivors, Yiddish speaking, than any other city in the world. So there was a lot of Yiddish in Tel Aviv in the late 40s and 50s, and newspapers and presses and events. It's just that it wasn't the language of the schools or of the theater or of the opera, but it existed. And being able to teach Yiddish to a new generation of Israelis, and then to bring international students together with those Israelis to have that conversation about different sort of perspectives on Yiddish is really exciting. And to be able to do it in Sutzkever's adoptive city and to use him as one of the, let's say, guides to untangling this tangled history becomes even more exciting. So it's true that every generation has to discover its own language and its own past. And this is the one that this is the task of historians and literary scholars now and linguists to do so.
Okay, lovely. This is, I think, a wonderful way for us to end. If I can, on behalf of the Institute and myself and everybody who's attended the talk, if I can thank you very much. This is, it's been fascinating in more ways than I can say. And the fact that you wrapped up talking about your you know, activities teaching Yiddish, I mean, on top of all of your duties at your home university and your various accolades, and congratulations on your your awards and the conversation that we had just ahead of just before we went live, that you were
Right.
teaching an overload this semester. I think everybody should be aware of just how much you're doing. It's clearly a labor of love. It comes through very clearly. But I'm grateful that you managed to squeeze us in, and we're the
Well,
benefactors of your
no,
energy
no.
and your.
I am just so happy to have been invited and to have had this time and opportunity to talk to friends of the Institute and the broader community.